main fighting force of Germany in World War II, considered the most powerful army in the world at this time. In July 1943, the Soviet Union established the National Committee for a Free State and then a Union of German officials under the supervision of the cordless desktop. However, to successfully propagandize against the Soviet Union, Spark 39's success was incorrect. Soviet government needed a very famous German, someone like the ruler of the powers. Those who worked with him at the time said he was a responsible and conscientious soldier, a notoriously corrupt officer. Specifically, he participated in developing the campaign and the infamous perisher who invaded the Soviet Union in the war. Before the Battle of Stalingrad, Power was the chief of the practical department, doing paperwork at the front. The House took Korn into the Powers. Making Power commander of the 6th Corps in 1942 was a fatal mistake. Before that, he even sent of the Central. The group knew another weakness of Power's LG. This man in 39's blind faith and, above all, his refusal to commit suicide was essentially the first instance of an officer refusing to obey the wishes of his superior. However, even when captured as a prisoner of war, the Marshal stated that he remained a when he discovered the formation of the anti-Nazi alliance. Initially, he strongly condemned the alliance, and when you give up everything, even if you in Faith 39, very reluctant, you in 39 lel. Learn from Min Kai, Verse said, that the Soviet Union used psychological tactics. Power changed his views at Power in Faith 39's friend was General Alan Vasiliev, a German historian, for participating in the conspiracy against Hitler. In July 1944, this also played an important role in Marshal Pauna's establishment. From then on, Felice began to see himself as just a pawn in a game of chance. On August 8, 1944, a half after being captured, he spoke on German radio, told the soldiers about his actions. For Germany, the war was over, or Germany would give up pork. That was the first but not the last speech of the law. Yes, he joined the ranks of the German Federal Council and repeatedly called on the German people to resist completely. Later, he gave strong anti-fascist speeches. A father working in the Soviet government, he later became a consultant for in 39's film about the Battle of Stalingrad. After Stalin 39's death, Powers applied for a transfer to East Germany and died of illness in 1957. He was born on September 23, 1890 in the Grand National Square of Germany. The son of a teacher, Paulo Brazil entered the Imperial German Naval Academy as a student, but was unsuccessful. He then applied to study law to university, but after a while he left university. In February 1910, Power joined the Army, serving in the 11th Infantry Regiment as a trainee officer. Family with Mrs. Elena. Logistic regression on World War. I broke Alan 39's unit, participating in the attack on France. Later, House served as a staff officer in the Army Corps until the end of World War. House held the rank of colonel, then was appointed company commander in the Infantry Regiment, the friend in the photo, to 1933, then commander of the World Auto Battalion from to 1935 before becoming Chief of Staff of the Washington Force. Father in October 1935 was assigned the task of organizing and building the 3rd Complete. Then from May 1939, Health Duck Thang became a Major General and Chief of Staff of Army Group X. The unit was transformed into Army Group 6 and fought on the Dutch and Belgian fronts. From August 1940, Power was promoted to Lieutenant General and appointed Deputy Chief of Staff of the 6th Army. In this position, he commanded the offensive against the German forces in January 1942. He was the commander of 6th Army in the offensive against Glass, but was defeated by the German forces. Power surrendered to the Soviet Union, which would provide food for the wounded and sick, treat the sick, and allow all prisoners to retain their military uniforms, medals, and personal belongings. Power had 24 hours to respond. He immediately reported the Soviet Union of A-39's ultimatum and demanded freedom of action. He vehemently rejected the Soviet demands on the morning of January 10, 24. Hours after the deadline, the Soviet Army launched a naval artillery assault with 5,000 artillery shells. Fierce battle lasted 6 days, during which the German forces concentrated in half of the Viet Nam range. Until January 20, 1943, Nyan Duc was cut in two and lost control of the emergency air route. Finally, ground aircraft could no longer land to deliver supplies, including medicine, to the German army. Once again, the Soviet army gave the enemy a chance to surrender. A Soviet representative arrived at the German front line with the offer to force one. He was once again caught between the duty to obey the insane leader and the responsibility to save the remaining soldiers to prevent their annihilation. The army called for reinforcements to arrive in time. With no more food or supplies, the army could no longer command effectively. With 8,000 wounded soldiers without supplies, bandages, or medicine, continuing the defense inevitable, the division demanded permission to surrender immediately to save the remaining soldiers. However, the 6th Corps was forbidden from surrendering and forced to hold its position to the last man with the last bullet. On January 30th, a radio bus called, promising that the last man would arrive within 24 hours. This news caused the Supreme Command to receive a shower of awards for officers, hoping that such honors would inspire a determination to sacrifice themselves gloriously on the bloody battlefield. Power via radio received the rank of Field Marshal. Approximately 110 other officers also received this rank. This was a move-in Hitler and A-39's devilish game. He wanted Power to fight to the death. The German forces had already been routed by the Soviets at this point, with 91,000 German soldiers remaining. All 24 generals were starving, suffering from frostbite, many wounded, all in agony. If they took a blood-soaked blanket to cover themselves against the freezing cold of 20 degrees Celsius, they would march across the ice and snow towards the prisoner of war camps. The 20,000 Romanian soldiers and 29,000 civilians had been airlifted back. That was all that remained of an army or military force of only 80,000 men. Even before that, among the 91 men captured as prisoners of war in the winter at the headquarters of the Nazi dictator Hitler, he berated the generals on Instagram, saying that they should have reinforced their ranks, spread out their troops, and shot themselves with bullets. Finally, they should have ended their own lives, but the former commander threw himself on the wall of his prison when he saw he had failed. He spoke on the radio, beginning to call on the German army to eliminate Hitler. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a crucial turning point in World War. After the War House testified to the original history of the German leaders who emerged in 1953, 2 years later, all the surviving German prisoners of war, mostly his own, were released after the N-Quat Desert Glass Aquat operation. The Soviet Union also allowed the return of 91 prisoners of war. He saw that only about 6,000 German soldiers returned home. He became a police inspector in the German Democratic Republic until his death on 1957. An ill These days, 76 years ago, the German Empire was taking its final steps towards. However, the most horrific wars in history ended just 4 months later. There is still much debate about why the British and German armies did not arrive in Berlin before the Soviet Red Army, according to author William Severn of the book Quat, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Quat. This also had a significant impact from the masters of propaganda of Nazi Germany. The latest news, ladies and gentlemen, is that Robert Viet-39's final discovery of the German war machine helped Nazi Germany in world. In the pincer movement of February 1945, there was virtually no chance left for Nazi Germany to turn the tide. 6 months after the inter-territory landings, the Anglo-American coalition made significant advances in the north, supporting the Soviet Red Army and 39's devastating offensive. In the east, the military defeat was only a part of the overall bleak picture as gray as the uniforms of German officers. The bombing raids by the Anglo-American Air Forces devastated the industrial region, while the Upper Silesia region on the other side of the continent, almost devoid of coal, saw production plummet to only 20% of the previous year. Furthermore, transporting coal to sustain the dying embers of the German war machine became even more difficult because all transportation routes were heavily attacked. The Nazi German naval commander cried out in despair because too many ships under his command were left in a state of disarray. After the 9 coal mines were completed, there was nothing else they could do. On land, hundreds of power plants and weapons factories were in a similar situation. However, fuel became the Achilles and a 39 heel of the army, which once sowed terror throughout the world at the beginning of World War II. Before the devastating attacks on Moscow, Adolf Hitler had to send troops to seize the oil wells in Romania, and now the Air Force has taken back everything. At once, artificial oil production plants are being ravaged by attacks. Without fuel, they cannot. Fe-39's only fair that they defend those facilities. The aircraft like the Enquat, Sun Thap 2 Denquat, a type of rocket, sit idle on the runway waiting for the enemy to destroy them. Furthermore, armored vehicles are becoming even more vulnerable. After the classic tank battle, where they suffered a crushing defeat against the massive T-34 tanks of the Soviet Red Army at the Arc de Triomphe, cutting down the once formidable enemy regiments, even the Enquat, Quat, a type of armored vehicle, needs fuel, even if only for the sake of moving into defensive positions. At the end of February 1945, the Allied forces, American, British, and French, began crossing the Rhine River. On 1945, all the most important divisions had completed the capture of key bridgeheads. General Parton and Fe-39's troops advanced towards Frankfurt in the south. British and Canadian troops, acting as American units, entered the area. 1945. German Armaments Minister Albert Speer noted, and quote, "Who can be sure that within 4 to 8 weeks the economy will collapse and the war will not end?" A quote, chaos engulfed Ferrer and Fe-39's headquarters outside British and Canadian divisions under Field Marshal Summary were heavily damaged. When Enderman and 339's forces were reduced in number and then controlled the entire Bentatius region, they quickly advanced to the Elbe River in central Germany. On April 11, American troops were stationed at Magdeburg, 100 kilometers from the palace. At that time, Berlin was only defended by a few new divisions. Red Army had just begun its advance along the Danube River. The territory still known as Austria was considered to be focused on strengthening its control over all European territories to establish a protective perimeter for the future, rather than trying to send troops quickly to race against its allies in Asia. The desperate situation was that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and later British military leaders constantly complained about the Red Army and 39's advance, establishing an enduring symbolic image, the image of a Red Army soldier planting the flag on top of the German Parliament building. Furthermore, in general, few agree that this goodwill of the Red Army was to repay the boundless sacrifices of the Soviet Union and Fe-39's people and soldiers, a nation that suffered the heaviest human losses in World War. William Hill offers a different explanation. At that time, when the Allied forces, including the US, UK, France, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, wanted to cut Germany in two, the lines of communication were intended to limit the potential risks arising from the rampage of a monstrous beast. He wanted to prevent the United States from fighting and suffering further losses on the treacherous streets of Berlin. But not only that, he and his staff were also influenced by intelligence gathered in March 1904. Nazi Germany had built a fortified stronghold in the mountainous region, and Hitler would help command the defense from the sheer cliffs covered in snow and ice. in what was called the Bert and Fee 39's Garden Resort, a place personally overseen by Hitler. Reports indicated that if it truly existed, the area would be impregnable, sheltered by nature, and the most effective weapons had not yet been deployed. The forces that had previously ruled Germany would reorganize. They would manufacture weapons in factories in Trang, bomb store food in warehouses, and deploy a new army of young, trained men regarding guerrilla warfare and then rearmament, as well as directing the army to liberate Germany from moving forces. Receiving a colorful report about this rabbit, the observator did in Fe 39 wanted, but his badass chief of staff also spoke up, hinting at a prolonged campaign in the jungle that could cause heavy losses to the thinking line or prolong the war indefinitely. And so any student who wanted to personally bring the Vietnamese military to tightly control every road would do it. But that report was precisely a legend. The Minh military alarm probably fell into the trap of a master of propaganda, the father of the proposition that lies repeated many times will become truth, the rice and sandals when witnessing the inevitable decline of the Third Reich. Hitler in 39's most trusted confidant mobilized his last nerve cell before the story about this so-called national fortress. Bells, the original author of the legend about a magical weapon capable of changing the course of the war, that is the article. The arrays, the V-1 flying bombs, and their subsequent destruction were repeatedly captured by Allied forces along the march route. Their imprint is still enough to warrant one Valozan photos. Perhaps that was also the last time the cunning Dr. Bells could influence the course of the war with such a bluff on television, and that in 39's all defeat of Nazi Germany. Marshal Zhukov did in Fe 39 need to rush the tanks. What about the red one? He in 39 will cause trouble anytime. He in Fe 39's always ready to turn green. About a few billion music. Music.